So one of the things we want to try to understand in political capitalism is how it is that the elite are able to capture the policy-making process. Let me give you some additional examples. Here's Joseph Stiglitz. I tend to think of Stiglitz as sort of on the left-leaning end of the political spectrum. Stiglitz says, it's one thing to win a fair game. It's quite another to be able to write the rules of the game and to write them in ways that enhance one's prospects of winning. And it's even worse when you can choose your own referees. And at the other end of the political spectrum, I tend to think of David Stockman as more leaning toward the right. David Stockman says, we have a rigged system, a regime of crony capitalism. In truth, the historic boundary between the free market and the state has been eradicated, and therefore anything that can be peddled by crony capitalists is fair game. So it's kind of interesting, if I'm right in characterizing Stiglitz as leaning to the political left, Stockman is leaning to the political right. It's interesting to see the commonality of their views. And actually, these two books that were published around the same time, until you get to the conclusions, what the message that they have is almost interchangeable. Now, their conclusions, as far as policy recommendations, are different. On the left, somebody like Stiglitz, think we need more government oversight, we need more regulation, and so forth. On the right, people like Stockman think government is the problem, we need less government. But until you get to those policy conclusions, there's a huge amount of similarity between the ideas of people on the left and people on the right. As I say, the problem was widely recognized, if not widely understood. Here, Stiglitz and Stockman again. Stiglitz says, when one interest group holds too much power, it succeeds in getting policies that benefit itself rather than policies that would benefit society as a whole. And Stockman, at the other end of the political spectrum, our government is no longer a system of democratic choice and governance. It is a tyranny of incumbency and money politics. The gangs of crony capitalism will fight tooth and nail to preserve their slice of an imperiled pie, thereby disenfranchising even further ordinary taxpayers and citizens who have no voice in the Washington policy auctions. So here, if you just look at the popular recognition, the general recognition of these issues, everybody from political left to political right sees the problem. There are an elite few who make public policy, and they tend to make those policies for their own benefit. And then there are the masses who are essentially disenfranchised. They bear the costs of the policies that are passed by the elite. So there are two groups of people, the cronies and everybody else. We give them different names, the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat, the elite versus the masses, and in the Occupy Wall Street language, the 1% versus the 99%. So how is it that this system is able to exist? How is it that it's able to perpetuate itself? And so what I want to do is to try to build a theory of political capitalism so that we can understand what's behind it, how this system works. And the building blocks of political capitalism, I'm going to rest heavily on elite theory that tells us who benefits, and public choice theory that explains how they benefit. Neither one of these theories by themselves does the whole job. Elite theory, developed by sociologists and political scientists for more than a century, the elite versus the masses. That elite theory tells us who benefits, but it doesn't explain how they benefit. Public choice theory explains how some people are able to benefit at the expense of others. We have theories of rent-seeking, regulatory capture, interest group politics. That these aspects of public choice theory describe how it is that some benefit at the expense of others, but it doesn't identify that there is a systematic group of people who always are the beneficiaries and the masses who typically bear the costs. So elite theory tells us who benefits. Public choice theory tells us how they benefit. And one thing that's kept economists from really seeing this theory of political capitalism as a whole is economists tend to take a very individualistic approach to social science in general. It's individuals who act. It's not groups who act. It's individuals who act. And I'm sympathetic with that. But as we push this idea, what we do is we leave out the fact that individuals are members of groups, and some groups are able to systematically work together for their own benefit. Now, an example of that individualistic approach comes in James Buchanan and Gordon Tulloch's book, The Calculus of Consent. And so Buchanan and Tulloch say they reject any theory or conception of the collectivity which embodies the exploitation of a ruled by a ruling class. This includes the Marxist vision, which incorporates the polity as one means through which the economically dominant group imposes its will on the downtrodden. And so basically, what Buchanan and Tulloch, starting off this way in their book, The Calculus of Consent, was take off the table a possibility of seeing this theory of political capitalism because they take such an individualistic approach. So let me talk a little bit about elite theory. And we can see in a lot of work in economics the foundations that lead us to understand how elite theory works. We can see an economic foundation for elite theory. We see it in Mansur-Olson's theory of group action, where small concentrated groups have an advantage over larger groups. Even in Buchanan and Tulloch's book, while they reject this notion of group action, do note that logrolling and political exchange benefit the people who engage in exchanges. And one key thing to understand here is that the idea of logrolling, it's political exchange. Sometimes it's vote trading, but it can be more than that. Sometimes it's like a political IOU. If you're a legislator, you might just, you vote for my bill, I'll vote for yours. But sometimes the transaction occurs over time. So a legislator says, will you support my bill? Another says, okay, I will. But then an IOU is developed, so later on, the second legislator goes back and says, remember when I supported your bill? Now I need your help. It's political exchange. And because there's a small number of people, you keep track of those political IOUs and you have to pay your debts. Otherwise, you'll be left out of those political exchanges in the future. And logrolling occurs in other ways too. Will you support my bill? I need your support. I don't know. We can provide some money for your district to build such and such. Okay, if you do that, put that in the bill, then I'll support it. So those are examples of political exchange. But those political exchanges can only occur among people where there are low transaction costs, so they're actually able to engage in exchange. I'm guessing that most of you, like me, aren't in that group where we can engage in political exchange. We just have to accept the legislation that's passed by the political insiders. That's the difference between the elites and the masses. Now, the Coase Theorem provides a good economic foundation for elite theory. This elite theory is rare to see it in economics. It's common to see it in sociology and political science. But there's a strong economic foundation for elite theory in the Coase Theorem. So many of you will be familiar with the Coase Theorem. Let me just talk about it a little bit in the context of markets and then extend it to politics. One way to look at the Coase Theorem is the Coase Theorem says, in the absence of transaction costs, resources are allocated to their highest valued use. So let's think about what that means. In the absence of transaction costs, what does that mean? It means nothing is standing in the way of us making a mutually advantageous exchange. In the absence of transaction costs, resources are allocated to their highest valued uses. Okay, so nothing is standing in the way, low transaction costs, nothing is standing in the way of transaction costs. Resources are allocated to their highest valued uses because the people who value them the most are able to bargain to get them, to buy them, to engage in transactions to get them. So the Coase Theorem, I mean, there's a kind of a common sense explanation here to the Coase Theorem. If nothing is standing in the way of mutually advantageous exchange, then the parties to the exchange can allocate resources to their highest valued uses because the people who value them the most can buy them. So let me give you, if we think about the Coase Theorem, a common example in economics is air pollution. So let's say we have a steel mill, and the steel mill is selling steel to an automobile manufacturer. And so they engage in transactions, so the steel is bought and sold. There are low transaction costs, so it's easy for the auto manufacturer and the steel manufacturer to get together and engage in exchange, so they can maximize the value of that exchange to themselves. And then, but the air pollution example, now here this steel mill is creating all of this air pollution. And there are tens of thousands of people in the vicinity who are breathing polluted air, but they are in a high transaction cost group. It's difficult to get tens of thousands of people to organize to get together to bargain with the steel mill. So the whole idea of an externality here, right, is the people in the low transaction cost group, that's the steel manufacturer, the auto manufacturer, they engage in transactions that maximize the value of resources to themselves. Then there are other people in the high transaction cost group, those are the people who are breathing the polluted air. They face high transaction costs. They're not able to engage in a bargain to negotiate to reduce air pollution. They suffer the externality. The resources that are allocated by people in the low transaction cost group, the steel manufacturer, the auto manufacturer, impose costs on the people in the high transaction cost group. That's a theory of externalities that's common in economics. And it's an application of the Coase Theorem. Now, let's apply that Coase Theorem to politics. We have a group of people who are in the low transaction cost group. They're the people who make public policy. In my earlier example, it's like the steel manufacturer, the auto manufacturer. But in politics, it's legislators, it's lobbyists, it's people who have political connections. Those are the people in the low transaction cost group. They get together, they negotiate, they maximize the value of resources to themselves. But just like the people who are breathing the polluted air in my market example, the masses, most people, most voters, most citizens, they're in the high transaction cost group. They don't have anything to say about public policy. Right? I mean, you can vote. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but your individual vote isn't going to make much of a difference. Those are the people in the high transaction cost group. So if we just apply the Coase Theorem to politics, we see some people are in the low transaction cost group, legislators, lobbyists, big businessmen who have connections to the political system. They're in the low transaction cost group. They maximize the value of public policy to themselves. Most people are in the high transaction cost group. They don't have any say in what policies are passed. They're unable to go to the legislature and say, hey, here's something that would benefit me. They're in the high transaction cost group. So the actions of the people in the low transaction cost group, the cronies, the insiders, the people with political connections, they maximize the value of public policy to themselves. And just like the people who breathe the polluted air in the market example, the masses often end up bearing the costs of those public policies. And it's not, just like in the externalities example, it's not that the elite, the insiders, the people with connections, it's not that they're trying to impose costs on the masses. It's just that it doesn't matter to them. Right? I mean, it's like the steel mill is making steel to produce for the auto manufacturer. They don't consider the costs that they impose on other people in the process. And the same thing is true in politics, that the insiders, the elite, the people with political connections, they do what's best for them. And just like the people breathing the polluted air, often the costs get imposed on the masses. So